This is Steve Young for the Co Roundtable. I just wanted to bring to your attention a couple of things in defense of capitalism. This is sort of the side of the story which sometimes is dismissed and doesn't get heard, or it's trashed. One article by a very conservative American politician, former Senator Phil Gramm, wrote recently about the Gilded Age, which was the sort of the excess of wealth and robber barons in American history in the late 1900s. But Graham's point is, if you look at data at what this burst of economic growth and wealth created, it helped a lot of people. According to Graham, between 1870 and 1900, 30 years, America's inflation-adjusted gross national product expanded by an unprecedented 233%. Though the population nearly doubled, real per capita GNP surged by 90%. Real wages of non-farm employees grew by 53%. And life staples such as food, clothing, and shelter became more plentiful and much cheaper. Food prices plummeted by 174%, and the cost of textiles, fuel, and home furnishings fell by 70, 65, and 70% respectively. The illiteracy rate, mostly among the poor, fell by 46%, and life expectancy rose 12.5%. Infant mortality declined by 17%. Now, what are we to make of this? If all these statistics are true, a great many good things happened to a lot of Americans, but at the same time, there was a relatively small number of Americans at the time. Then they were millionaires. Today they're billionaires. And they probably had a disproportionate share of the income and the wealth that the country had. So are we talking about this kind of capitalism as something black or something white or something that's mixed? Another recent article written by David Brooks, who's a moderate, writes for the New York Times, also talks about the power of American capitalism recently. He says, back in 1990, America's gross domestic product per capita was nearly neck and neck with that of Europe and Japan. But by 2022, the US had raced ahead. In 1990, the US economy accounted for 40% of nominal GDP of the G7 nations. By 2022, the US accounted for 58%. In 1990, American income per person was 24% higher than the income per person in Western Europe. Today, it is about 30% higher. The level of education is one reason American labor productivity increased by 67% between 1990 and 1922, compared with a 55% increase in Europe and a 51% increase in Japan. Again, what are we to make of these figures? Because they all tend to indicate that life in many ways is getting better for Americans. At the same time, as we know from other data, wealth has become increasingly concentrated in the hands of a few people. But to go back to Senator Graham, he has pointed out that many of the studies of wealth concentration do not take into account income transfers, such as welfare and other kinds of income transfer payments. When those are taken into account, the inequality tends to shrink. So we have a system which on the one hand generates great inequality, but on the other hand increasingly generates wealth which is shared to some extent. Now, what are we to make of all this?